I stood at my kitchen window the morning the certified letter arrived, watching the Tennessee fog settle over the hills. Carol and I had looked at together for 31 years, and I thought about how strange it is that the things we build our whole lives around can be dismantled by a single signature on a piece of paper. My name is Harold Briggs. I'm 66 years old. I spent 38 years as a general contractor in Nashville, pouring foundations, framing walls, building homes for other families, while I slowly, carefully built a life for my own. I am not a wealthy man by any standard Derek would recognize, but I am a man who never owed anyone a dollar I hadn't already earned, and I raised my daughter to understand the difference between what you need and what you want. I thought I had, anyway. Let me take you back to where this really started, about 8 months before that letter showed up. It was a Saturday in February, and my daughter called me from the restaurant. Not to chat, not to check on me the way she used to after her mother passed, but to tell me that Derek had something important he wanted to discuss as a family. The way she said it, her voice carrying that careful brightness she'd picked up from him, I already felt the temperature drop in my chest. I drove to Ember's Table that evening. That was the name of Derek's restaurant, which I still find ironic given the name of this channel. Ember's Table. He'd named it himself, thought it sounded sophisticated. It was a farm-to-table concept in East Nashville, the kind of place with exposed brick and a chalkboard menu and cocktails named after obscure literary references. He'd opened it 4 years earlier with $140,000 in startup capital. 60 of that had come from me. I want to be clear about that. I gave my son-in-law $60,000 when he married my daughter, not because I believed in the restaurant business, but because I believed in my daughter's happiness. Because she looked at Derek the way her mother used to look at me before things got hard, with that particular kind of hope that deserves to be honored. So I wrote the check, and I kept my doubts to myself. The restaurant was nearly empty when I arrived. A Thursday night that should have had a 2-week reservation wait, according to Derek, had maybe 8 tables occupied. He met me at the door in his chef's coat, which he always wore even when he wasn't cooking, and walked me to the back corner booth like he was seating a dignitary. My daughter was already there, her hands wrapped around a glass of wine, her smile doing that thing it did when she was nervous, stretching just slightly too wide. "Dad, we're so glad you came." She stood and hugged me, and I held on a second longer than usual because something in her perfume reminded me of Carol. And grief has a way of arriving without warning. Derek sat across from me and launched in before the server could bring my water. He had a folder on the table, which I noticed immediately. Derek always had a folder when he wanted something. It was a habit from his sales days, this performance of preparation, as though the visual prop of organized paperwork would make the ask feel more like a business proposition and less like what it actually was. "Harold, I want to be straight with you because that's the kind of relationship I think we have." He folded his hands on top of the folder. Ember's Table is in a transitional period. I looked at my daughter. She looked at the wine glass. "Transitional," I said. "The market has shifted. Post-pandemic dining habits, inflation hitting food costs. We've had to make adjustments." He opened the folder to reveal a spreadsheet I didn't need to examine closely to understand. Red numbers have a particular way of communicating. The thing is, we have a real opportunity right now. There's a second location available on Music Row, a space that would take us from neighborhood gem to city institution. But we need capital to make the move and stabilize the current operation at the same time. "How much capital?" I asked. "Dad," my daughter reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "We're not asking you to give us anything. It would be a loan, with interest, even if you want." "How much?" Derek didn't blink. $400,000. I looked at him for a long moment, then I looked at my daughter again. She was still watching the wine glass. "I want you to understand what $400,000 meant in the context of my life. After Carol died 3 years ago, I sold the contracting business to my partner for $620,000. That money, combined with our retirement savings and the equity in our home, represented everything Carol and I had built together over 3 decades of 6-day work weeks, of driving used trucks and taking vacations to state parks instead of the Caribbean, of Carol clipping coupons until the day she got too sick to hold scissors. We had been comfortable but never extravagant. The $600,000 from the business sale was meant to see me through the rest of my life without being a burden to anyone. Derek was asking me for more than half of it. I already gave you $60,000 when you opened, I said quietly. That was 4 years ago, Derek said, and his voice had taken on a different quality, something with an edge. This is different. This is about scaling, about legacy. Whose legacy? I asked. He looked at me like I'd said something beneath the conversation. Harold, you don't have children to leave this money to, except Amanda. Why let it sit in an account when it could be working, building something with your family's name on it? The restaurant doesn't have my family's name on it, I said. It has yours. The silence at that table had a texture to it. Derek's parents, I should mention, had been in Florida since retirement. His father had sold a chain of dry cleaning businesses in 2019 for what I understood to be a significant sum. They had a house in Sarasota with a pool and a boat slip. They had never contributed a single dollar to Ember's table. Not at opening, not during the pandemic when Derek was weeks from closing and called my daughter crying at 2 a.m. They sent a fruit basket when the restaurant won a local food blogger's Best New Spot award. That was the extent of their investment in their son's dream. I thought about that as I sat across from Derek's folder and my daughter's averted eyes. I told them I needed time to think. I drove home in the particular silence of a man who already knows what his answer will be, but hasn't yet decided how much of himself he's willing to explain. 3 weeks later, I called my daughter. Not Derek, my daughter. I told her that I loved her more than I had words for, that I had supported her and her husband's dream with everything I felt was appropriate given my circumstances and my responsibility to my own future, that I would not be providing $400,000, that if the restaurant needed that level of capital to survive, the answer was not her 66-year-old father's retirement fund. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Derek said you'd say that." I held the phone and looked at Carol's photograph on the mantel. She was laughing in the picture, caught mid-sentence at some dinner party, her head thrown back, completely unguarded. I took that photo because I loved seeing her like that, fully herself. "What does that mean?" I asked. She said she needed to go. She'd call me later. She didn't call me later. 2 months passed. I reached out 4 times, twice by phone, twice by text. The responses were brief and politely distant, the kind of communication that exists purely to prevent the other person from claiming total silence. Derek was screening my access to my own daughter, and we both knew it, and my daughter was allowing it, and that knowledge sat in my sternum like a stone I couldn't dislodge. Then the letter arrived. I opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with my second cup of coffee, and the particular morning light that comes through the window Carol always said was her favorite. The firm's name was Alderman, Voss & Cole, attorneys at law. The return address was a building on Broadway I'd driven past 1,000 times. They were suing me. My daughter and son-in-law were suing me for $750,000. I read the document 3 times, each time slower than the last. The way you reread something that cannot possibly say what you think it says. The claims were elaborate and specific in the way that only calculated dishonesty can be. They alleged that I had, on multiple occasions over the course of my daughter's marriage, made verbal commitments to fund their business endeavors, that I had told Derek directly, and I am quoting the document here, that I considered his success to be the same as my own, and would ensure he had what he needed to build a lasting enterprise. They alleged that my refusal constituted a breach of implied contract. They further alleged that by withholding funds I had promised, I had caused the business to suffer quantifiable losses that, when projected against the second location's revenue potential, amounted to no less than $750,000. Projected revenue potential. They were suing me based on money a restaurant that didn't yet exist might theoretically have made. There was a third claim that I had to read twice to fully process. They alleged emotional distress. My daughter's statement, attached as an exhibit, described the psychological harm caused by a father who weaponizes financial resources as a means of control, who had spent years creating a pattern of conditional love that had damaged her capacity for secure attachment. I put the papers down. I sat with my hands flat on the table for a while. I thought about the year Carol was in treatment, when I worked 7 days a week so the insurance gaps wouldn't break us. I thought about dropping my daughter at her college dorm with a truck full of secondhand furniture I'd refinished myself because new would have been too much that year. I thought about sitting with her on a hospital bench when Carol had her second surgery, the two of us drinking bad vending machine coffee at 2 in the morning, her head on my shoulder, neither of us saying anything because there was nothing to say. Conditional love. I called my attorney that afternoon. Susan Park had handled Carol's estate and my business sale. She was methodical, thorough, and had a way of delivering hard truths with a steadiness that made them bearable. "Harold," she said, after I read her the relevant portions, "I want to ask you some questions. Did you ever, in writing or verbally, promise Derek a specific dollar amount for the restaurant?" "Never." "Did you use language to the effect that you'd always support them financially? Words like 'whatever it takes' or 'I'll always be there'?" I thought carefully. I told my daughter I loved her and would always be there for her. I said I was proud of what they were building. I never attached a dollar figure to any of it. "Good. That's the distinction that matters." She paused. "I won't sugarcoat this. They've found a firm willing to argue implied contract on the basis of an established pattern of giving, meaning the $60,000 at opening and other gifts over the years. It's a stretch, but a judge will have to formally dismiss it or let it go to trial. How much is this going to cost me? To fight it fully? Could be 35, 40,000 if we go to trial." I closed my eyes briefly. Do it. The months that followed were a kind of sustained unreality. Depositions in conference rooms that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. Document requests that required me to produce bank statements and tax returns and retirement account summaries. Every number I'd spent a lifetime quietly accumulating now, laid out under fluorescent lights for strangers to examine. The opposing attorney was a young man named Prescott who wore pocket squares and addressed me with the particular condescension reserved for people he considered to be misers, dressed up as good fathers. "Mr. Briggs, isn't it true that at your son-in-law's restaurant opening, you stated publicly that you were proud to have helped make this dream possible?" I said I was proud of my daughter. "But you acknowledged your financial contribution publicly." I answered a guest question about the business. "Yes." "And would you characterize your overall relationship with your son-in-law as supportive?" "I would characterize it as civil." His deposition of Derek, which Susan shared with me afterward, was more revealing. Derek described me as an emotionally withholding man who communicated love through financial control. He described the $60,000 gift not as generosity, but as a down payment on equity he'd never actually received. He said, and I want to make sure I get this right because it matters, that he had structured his entire business plan around the assumption that I would continue providing capital as needed, that my income and my retirement savings represented a resource his family had every reasonable right to expect access to. Assume, expect, right. Susan filed a motion to dismiss. It was denied. We were going to trial. In the weeks before the court date, something happened that changed the shape of everything. Susan's investigator, a quiet woman named Donna who drove a sensible car and asked questions like she was already bored by the answers, looked into the restaurant's actual financials. Not the projections Derek had shown me in the folder. The real books. What she found was this. In the 18 months before the confrontation at Ember's table, Derek had withdrawn a total of $94,000 from the business account through a series of transfers to a personal account that was not the joint account he shared with my daughter. The restaurant wasn't failing because of market conditions. It was failing because its owner had been systematically draining it to cover losses from an online gambling habit that had been escalating since before the wedding. There was more. Derek had applied for a personal loan of $40,000 using projected restaurant revenue as collateral. The application listed my net worth, obtained from documents he'd had access to through the estate process when Carol died, as evidence of available family support. He had been using me as collateral. My daughter did not know any of this. I was as certain of that as I was of anything. Whatever my feelings about the choices she had made in the preceding months, the woman I raised was not capable of knowing what her husband was doing to his own business and choosing to stand beside a lawsuit anyway. I knew that in the way you only know things about people you have watched grow from the very beginning. The night before the trial, I sat in the living room where Carol and I used to watch old movies on Saturday nights with the popcorn she always burned slightly and never apologized for because she said the char added depth. I tried to figure out where I had gone wrong, not as a father who made financial decisions, but as a father who raised a daughter who ended up in a room with a man like Derek. I thought about something Carol said near the end, when she was still strong enough to have real conversations, but the horizon had become visible. We were sitting on the back porch, watching the last of the summer light go, and she took my hand and said, "Harold, Amanda picks men who need rescuing. She has since she was 17. We need to make sure she learns to stop before it costs her something she can't get back." I'd said something deflecting, the way you do when the person saying the true thing is also the person you're not ready to imagine losing. I'd said she was being dramatic. Carol gave me the look she reserved for my most expensive evasions, and let it go. She was right. She was almost always right about the things that mattered. Trial day was a Wednesday. I wore the gray blazer I'd bought for Carol's memorial service because it was the only formal thing I owned that still fit properly, and I drove myself to the courthouse without telling anyone except Susan what time to expect me. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. The kind of room designed to make everything feel workmanlike and procedural, which is probably the point. My neighbor Ray was in the gallery. He'd insisted on coming, and I hadn't had the energy to discourage him. Derek's parents were not present. They were in Sarasota. I know this because my daughter had mentioned in one of her clipped texts that the trial conflicted with a fishing tournament her father-in-law had entered. My daughter sat at the plaintiff's table beside Derek and Prescott. She did not look at me when I came in. Derek looked at me once, briefly, with an expression I recognized from the restaurant that night. Calculation dressed as confidence. The judge was a man in his late 50s named Judge Raymond Okafor. He had been on the bench for 14 years and had a reputation, Susan told me, for very little patience with cases he considered to be wasting his courtroom. Prescott's opening painted me as a man who had dangled financial promises in front of a young entrepreneur and then withdrawn them at a critical moment out of personal spite. He used the word abandonment twice, which I thought was bold, given that I was the one sitting in a defendant's chair. Susan stood, and she was brief. She said this case was about a 66-year-old widower who had already given his son-in-law $60,000, who had never made a contractual promise of any further amount, and who was being sued by people who had spent 4 years making financial decisions based on an expectation they had invented themselves and never bothered to confirm. She said the evidence would show that the restaurant's financial difficulties predated my refusal and had a source entirely unrelated to any action or inaction on my part. The first day was testimony. Prescott called Derek first. Derek was composed and articulate, and described our relationship with a warmth that would have been touching if I hadn't been watching him do it from across a room while his wife refused to meet my eyes. He talked about how much he admired me, how I had been like a second father to him, how he had genuinely believed we were partners in the enterprise of building a future for my daughter. The partner language, Susan had warned me, was intentional. Implied partnership carries legal weight. Susan's cross-examination was surgical. She established the timeline of withdrawals. She established the gambling account. She established the loan application that listed me as an asset. Derek's composure developed small fractures under the surface, the kind you can only see if you know what composure looks like on a person who earns it rather than performs it. By the second day, his answers had become shorter. Then I took the stand. Prescott approached me with the particular energy of a man who had decided the best strategy was to make a grandfather seem like a miser. "Mr. Briggs, do you love your daughter?" "More than I have words for." "Do you want to see her succeed?" "I've dedicated the better part of my life to that." "Then why, when her husband's business was struggling, did you refuse to provide support you were financially capable of providing?" I took a breath. Because what he was asking for wasn't support. It was a subsidy for consequences neither of them were willing to face. "That's a very convenient philosophy," Prescott said. Susan objected on grounds that were sustained, but I could see the jury watching me, and I understood what she had planted. When it was Susan's turn, She asked me one question that I want to share here because I think it matters. Mr. Briggs, in nearly 4 decades as a contractor, what happened when a building's foundation had a problem? I said, you go back to the foundation, you don't add floors, you fix what's wrong at the base, or eventually the whole structure comes down on top of you. She nodded and sat down. The judge called both attorneys to the bench after my testimony. They spoke for several minutes while I sat in the witness stand watching my daughter, who was still looking at the plaintiff's table in front of her. Her hands were folded in her lap with a care that told me she was holding herself very still on purpose. Then Judge Okafor looked at Derek. Mr. Kowalski, I'm going to ask you something directly. Derek straightened. Of course, Your Honor. The judge picked up a document from his bench and looked at it for a moment before looking back. When you withdrew $94,000 from Ember's table's operating account over 18 months, what was your understanding of how that would affect your need for outside capital? The silence in that room was a particular kind. Derek's attorney started to rise, and the judge held up one hand without looking at him. I'm asking the witness. Derek said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then, quietly, I made mistakes. The judge looked at him over his glasses. You made financial decisions that contributed to the instability you then attributed to the defendant's refusal to fund you. Is that accurate? Derek looked at Prescott. Prescott's expression was professionally neutral. That's not the full picture, Derek said. Judge Okafor set down his glasses. Let me tell you what I see, Mr. Kowalski. I see a man who made poor decisions, borrowed against projections instead of reality, and when the gap between those two things became impossible to ignore, looked sideways at someone else's retirement account and decided that was the solution. And when that person said no, because it was their money and their retirement and their right to say no, you dressed up your disappointment as a legal claim and brought it into my courtroom. He turned to look at my daughter, Mrs. Kowalski. He said it with a gentleness that was different from how he'd addressed her husband. I want you to think about something, not for this case, for yourself, about what you know now that you didn't know when you agreed to file this lawsuit. My daughter looked up at the judge. Her eyes were wet. She nodded once, slightly. He put his glasses back on. I'm dismissing this case. I'm further ordering the plaintiffs to pay the defendant's legal fees in the amount of $38,400 to be paid within 60 days. He brought the gavel down, and I sat there in that gray blazer and felt nothing close to what I'd imagined winning would feel like. Ray put his hand on my shoulder in the parking lot. You did it, Harold. You beat them. I watched my daughter walk to Derek's car without turning around. I watched Derek open the passenger door, and she got in, and he got in, and they drove away. I stood in the November cold and thought about Carol burning the popcorn and being entirely unapologetic about it. I hadn't beaten anything. I'd survived something, which is not the same. Susan called me that evening with something she said she hadn't wanted to bring up before the verdict, not wanting to cloud my focus. When Carol had done her estate planning, in the months after her second surgery, when she was still strong enough to be practical about the things she loved, she had set up a separate trust, not part of the will, not something I had any hand in. She had done it on her own, through her own attorney, and she had done it specifically for Amanda. The trust held $280,000. The proceeds from a life insurance policy Carol had held since before we were married. One she had never mentioned to me because she wrote in the letter of instruction she left with the trust documents, she knew Harold would try to use it to pay off the mortgage early, which was exactly what I would have done. The trust became accessible when Amanda turned 40. She was 36 now, 4 years away. The conditions attached to it were 3. Amanda had to demonstrate financial independence for a period of no less than 12 months. She had to have no outstanding debts in litigation. And she had to have, in the language Carol had used and which her attorney had preserved exactly, made peace with her father. I sat in the kitchen reading the summary Susan had sent me, and I could not speak for several minutes. Carol had seen this. She had seen it from whatever vantage point a dying woman has on the people she loves best, and she had quietly, practically, set in motion a mechanism that required our daughter to become the woman we'd raised before she received what Carol had saved for her. She'd given Amanda a reason to find her way back. I didn't hear from my daughter for 14 months, long enough for the legal fees to be paid installment by reluctant installment, and for the story of the lawsuit to become something I could tell people without my voice changing register. Long enough for me to repaint the back porch and rebuild the steps and adopt a dog from the county shelter, a medium-sized brown animal of uncertain breed who Carol would have named something sensible and I named Captain. Then, one Sunday morning in January, while I was drinking coffee and watching Captain investigate the frost on the back grass, my phone rang. Dad. The word landed in the center of my chest and stayed there. I'm not going to describe every detail of that first conversation, because some things belong only to the people inside them. But I will tell you that she cried, and I let her, and that when she said she was sorry, she said it more than once and in more than one way, which is the kind of apology that means something. She was no longer with Derek. She had left him in the spring, when the truth about the gambling had finally surfaced completely. When she had found bank statements hidden in a winter coat, she was packing for goodwill, and understood for the first time that the story she'd been living in was not the story she had thought. The restaurant had closed in June. She was renting a studio apartment in East Nashville. She had gone back to the job she'd left when she married Derek, working in curriculum development for a nonprofit that trained adult literacy instructors. She liked the work. She was rebuilding. She said, "I think about that letter, Dad. The one with all those legal words. I signed it because Derek told me it was the only way to protect our future, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him. But I knew when I signed it, I knew what I was doing." "You were in a difficult situation," I said. "I was a coward," she said. "Call it what it is." I thought about Carol's face in that photograph on the mantel, fully herself, laughing. "Your mother would want me to tell you that you're being too hard on yourself," I said, and she'd be right. But she'd also want me to tell you that the fact that you can say what you just said is exactly what she always knew you were capable of. My daughter was quiet for a moment. "She didn't know Mom left me something." "I know. She said she talked to Carol's attorney last week. She got a letter explaining the trust, the conditions." I waited. "I wanted to call you before I knew any of that," she said. "I want you to know that. I called because I needed to, not because of money." "I know that too," I told her, "because I know you." We talked for almost 2 hours that morning. Captain came inside and fell asleep on my feet under the kitchen table. The frost burned off the yard, and the light shifted to mid-morning, and I stayed right where I was, at the kitchen table where I'd read a lawsuit and drunk cold coffee, and wondered where I had failed, and I listened to my daughter's voice and thought about how structures can look sound from the outside while everything underneath is quietly failing, and how sometimes the only way to save something is to let the weak parts come down. She started coming to dinner on the first Sunday of every month. She brought wine, the inexpensive kind she could actually afford, and she never apologized for it. We talked about her work and my garden and Captain and the contracting business, and the years when she was young and her mother was well, and Sunday dinners had a sound and smell I'd thought was gone permanently. In March, she brought someone with her. His name was Patrick. He taught high school history in Donaldson and had a handshake that meant something and didn't try too hard over dinner. He drove a truck that was older than my second renovation project. My daughter looked at him the way her mother used to look at me, with that particular kind of hope. This time I trusted it. Over dinner, Patrick asked me about the contracting work. He was genuinely curious, the kind of curious that asks follow-up questions. He wanted to know how I'd gotten into it, what the hardest job I'd ever done was, what I was proudest of. My daughter sat beside him and listened to stories she'd heard before with an expression I recognized because I used to watch her mother wear it. The expression of someone who is exactly where they want to be. After dinner, while Patrick was helping with the dishes in a way that was natural rather than demonstrative, my daughter came and stood beside me on the back porch. The spring air had that particular softness that only comes twice a year and only lasts a week. "Dad," she said, "I've been thinking about something. About what you said in the trial, about the foundation." "You heard that." Patrick showed me the transcript. He said it was the most useful thing he'd ever read about how to think about problems. I looked out at the yard where Carol's rose beds were coming back for the 4th spring without her. "The thing about foundations," I said, "is that you can't skip them and hope the frame will compensate. You can dress up the outside all you want, but if what you built your life on isn't solid, eventually you'll feel it underfoot." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I built my life on the wrong foundation for a long time." "We all do that once or twice," I said. "The question is whether you're willing to do the work of going back." She reached over and took my hand. She's 37 years old, and her hand still fits in mine the way it did when she was 7, which is one of the most reliable miracles I know. We stood there until Patrick finished with the dishes and came out to join us, and the three of us watched the yard go dark as the porch light came on automatically the way Carol had programmed it. On at dusk, off at 10, steady and reliable, and right on time. 14 months ago, I won a lawsuit I had never deserved to be in. I spent $38,000 defending the right to say no to a man who had been stealing from my daughter and blaming me for it. I lost a year of Sunday dinners and easy phone calls, and the particular comfort of knowing my daughter was all right. But here is what I want you to take from this. Whoever you are watching, wherever you are tonight, the no I said to Derek at that restaurant table was the most expensive word I have ever spoken. It cost me money and peace and a year of my daughter's presence. It cost me sleep and certainty and the easy story I used to tell myself about how I had gotten everything approximately right. And it was the right word. It was the only word that had any chance of leading us here. Because saying yes to someone who is determined to take from you is not generosity. It is not love. It is you agreeing to become the foundation of something that should never have been built, and when it collapses, it will collapse on you. I said no to a man who thought my retirement was a resource he was entitled to access. I said no to the version of my daughter who had convinced herself that standing beside him was the same as standing on solid ground. I said no to the idea that a father's love can be measured in dollar amounts, that what I had not given was evidence of what I did not feel. And that no, painful and expensive and lonely as it was, cleared enough ground for something better to grow. Carol knew that. She always knew. She saw it from whatever quiet place she watches from now, and she put the mechanism in place before she left. And she trusted me to hold the line long enough for our daughter to find her way back to it. I'm Harold Briggs. I'm 66 years old. I'm a retired contractor, a father, a widower, and the owner of a medium-sized brown dog who has no respect for property lines. I built homes for other families for 38 years, and I built one home for my own. And when it needed its foundation repaired, I went back to the foundation, because there is no other way to do it. My daughter is coming for dinner on Sunday. She is bringing Patrick, and he is bringing his famous peach cobbler, which my daughter tells me is genuinely extraordinary and which I am choosing to believe on good faith. Captain will sleep under the table, and we will talk too loud and stay too late. And when they leave, I will stand at the kitchen window in the light Carol always loved, and I will feel, as clearly and fully as anything I have ever felt, that what we have is solid. It took everything I had to build it. It was worth every cent.